Alexandra, also we decided that although in the program it's only Marco, that we'll do the presentation together in two parts. We've been focusing less on migration as such, but more the impact of migration on the Western Balkans, and in particular the EU integration process of those countries. So I will in a certain way give first the macro-political reflections of that, and Marco will follow up more on the kind of social impact of the migration quote-unquote crisis. Now, again, I think this is, I would make a few points really, because it's a very timely topic considering yesterday's decision regarding North Macedonia and Albania, and I think in a certain way it began in the context of the migration crisis, namely the question of the closing down of the enlargement and the replacement by what you could consider to be a geopolitical framing of Southeastern Europe. So when the crisis, and again I use the word crisis with the imaginary quotation marks around migration because of course this is very much the line we would take, began, of course, the Western Balkans for the first time after a number of years re-emerged in international and European news headlines. So after there was a neglect of attention to the region, it re-emerged, but it was very much framed again as a new hotspot. So it was framed as a place of conflict again. So like a lot of the rhetorical elements in Western media reporting resonated from the earlier 1990s, even though, of course, this time around, it wasn't that the Western Balkans were the source of conflict, but they just happened to be on the road of those seeking to escape a conflict to Europe. It was, of course, there were conflicts which have emerged over the last years, and they were usually over the passing of refugees. And we've seen that in the early days when Hungary began closing its border, when Serbia was, refugees were traveling through Serbia on the way to Hungary, and then it was transferred into a brief bilateral dispute between Serbia and Croatia at the peak when both countries accused each other of not being cooperative. Croatia accused Serbia of sending too many refugees and sort of dumping them on Croatia's doorstep, and this led to a very brief tension around the border at the peak of the migration flows. Again, this conflict had its own prehistory and is part of the nearly annual celebration of mutual animosity between Croatia and Serbia, usually around the day commemorating or celebrating the military operation Oluja in 1995, and the migration crisis dovetailed on that and highlighted these tensions. We've also seen it in domestic politics recently more, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where refugees were blocked in passing from one part of the country to another. So in a certain way what we're seeing is the juxtaposition of migration on existing fracture lines within the region where they become reinforced, be it between countries or be it within countries. But what we see is that, I would say that the lens I would like to look at is how the migration flows through the Western Balkans have been instrumentalized in terms of Europeanization discourses and politics in the region. So there were two options available for governments of the Western Balkans in 2015 and subsequent years: to be either the humanitarians of migration or to be the guardians of Europe. These were the two, in a certain way, discursive options available. And we have statements, for example, by Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić, who emphasized that he was more European than some EU member states were. And this was a way to prove this would be Europeanness. Now, we can discuss whether or not this was merit-based, but the understanding was one of showing one's Europeanness by treating refugees well. Although most of the treatment of refugees was more benign neglect than genuine care, or the care was provided mostly by NGOs, but it allowed the government to frame itself as a good European. Now the other argument, of course, is that of being a good border guard of Europe, the one who protects Europe from the unwanted influx of refugees. And this was, of course, the policy of the late Gruevski government, which had found itself in a political crisis just at the right moment, so to speak, in terms of the timing of the refugee flows, and was a willing accomplice or willing cooperator in closing the borders, and was, as was well documented, rewarded by, particularly the Austrian foreign ministry at the time, for cooperating and thanked, and we have the famous speech of the Austrian foreign minister at the time, Sebastian Kurz, at an election rally of the at the time ruling party, the Moreau, which praised its European path, which, at the time rang hollow and rings even more hollow today, but it was based on North Macedonia, or the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia at the time, playing along with the closing of the border, and thus supporting the Austrian project of closing the Western Balkan route of refugees. So these were the two options which were available for the governments of the region, and I would argue that they have, in a certain way, as a classical power relationship based on a peripheral position to Europe, basically sought the cues from central actors in the European Union of which signals to follow, which signals are the most suitable one for maximizing the own bargaining position towards Europe. So there we have basically an early phase, which is, I would call the more humanitarian phase, to the one which is the one of accepting the Orban logic of not just accepting barbed wire and fences, but also the rhetoric and self-professed position as border guards of Europe. But of course, this was in a certain way the one side. Now, from the other perspective, from the perspective of the EU to the region, to governments in the region, we see two moments. One is the securitization of relations, so the emphasis of security taking precedent over other elements. So a lot of technical support invested in border control, in ensuring security systems rather than in rule of law or other elements. Now, of course, we can have a long discussion to which degree the securitization also had rule of law elements, but the emphasis was security rather than rule of law. So the securitization of relations meant that the primary function shifted. And with it, it's the geopolitical paradigm, the logic that the primary motivation of relations is strategic rather than shared values. And this has, in effect, and not caused, but has in effect consolidated or facilitated authoritarian tendencies in the Western Balkans, which of course exist elsewhere, but certainly has eased this. It's not caused by migration or the European Union's response to migration, but it has allowed rulers in the region to present themselves as pivotal geopolitical players rather than as players which are converging in terms of values and rules towards the European Union. So this is the two dimensions of internal towards the outside and outside towards the region itself. And then in terms of the larger perception, or what this quote-unquote crisis has meant in terms of perception in the region, I would say, first of all, it's what Stefan Lehne at the time said, who works for Carnegie Europe, said we saw Europe without the EU in those months of 2015 and 2016. So it didn't look like there was a European Union. Solutions were found by member states who were building coalitions of, and coalitions of the willing cannot be used without a certain worrying backtone of the original term, which was used after all by George W. Bush in Iraq. So that hardly such a nice coalition. But the idea of building coalitions among member states and non-member states for particular policy goals, but disregarding the institutions and structures of the European Union. So it looked like Europe didn't have the European Union when it came to ending the refugee flows. So what did that mean? It meant that all of a sudden what has been already noted before, the nationalization of EU has become accelerated and more visible. The prominence and the prevalence of member states over the institutions became clearer, and we can say yesterday's decision not to decide or not to begin accession talks is in a certain way a reinforcement of this supremacy of the member state over the Union and its rules-based approach to the Western Balkans based on clear evaluations and recommendations, and that they are disregarded by member states. This is not new, but it's become more poignant, I would argue, in recent years. And also eventually the appropriation of the Europeanization, in a certain way, Europeanizing by adopting anti-immigrant policy. Now the interesting phenomena is, if you look at the region, it's not characterized by anti-immigrant attitudes. So if you look at, unlike when we heard earlier, anti-immigrant attitudes do not run high and are not prominent in government discourse or in citizens' attitudes across the region. So if people are asked what are key issues they are confronting with in the Western Balkans, migration is not in the top 10. It's not an important issue when citizens ask. Unemployment, corruption is, in Serbia it's Kosovo, it is #1 in a survey from last year, but it's not migration. But if citizens are asked of the Western Balkans, what is the biggest problem for Europe? They all say migration. So, so citizens of the Western Balkans in a survey from IRI end of last year said, in Bosnia, 25%, in North Macedonia, 30%, and in Serbia, 28% said that they thought that migration was the biggest problem for Europeans. So in a certain way, citizens know that migration is a big problem for Europeans, but don't think it's a big problem for them. So government policy, which is anti-immigrant or which is in a certain way worrying about migrants being stuck in the countries, which is the biggest concern, is motivated in a certain way in this relational situation with the larger European context. So it's not based on domestic opposition to migration as such, because in most of the countries there's a very clear expectation that those migrants are temporary and they're just seeking to leave. And in a certain way the EU borders are the problem, not the migrants as such. But in that sense, I would argue, and I would then hand over to Marko to the second part, and the structural impact is more about shaping relations between the region and the European Union, and in a certain way undermining the Europeanization narrative from earlier and replacing it with a geopolitical one where both sides see their relationship as one of maximizing very strategic goals rather than one of a kind of convergence of values and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Florian.